people had congregated in the market square to see if others needed help. FlowerDawn was like that. The people stuck close together and helped one another if need be. There were a lot of problems that needed sorting, ranging from trampled flowers to fully burnt down houses. Smashed windows were typical, as well as knocked down doors. Luckily, the village did have its fair share of carpenters, so these little problems could be sorted rather easily. Building a whole new house would take time, however, but it would be done. Nerves would need to be calmed in the young and old alike, and some villagers wandered around offering a little helping hand. "Small tipple of elderflower wine, Mrs. Loxton?" the young man asked. "Oh, lovely young man, just the job for me nerves," Mrs. Loxton replied gratefully. Gob Oxley, the owner of the tavern, the fetid stoat, was currently sweeping up glass from the tavern floor and muttering to himself. The stoat had taken the most damage for a building that hadn't been burnt down. It was a mess. The majority of the windows were smashed, as were most of the tables and chairs. The riders, having a good knowledge of how to break morale in people, had also destroyed a lot of alcohol on the premises. Gob had spent most of the morning ordering in reserves from Old Jack, the local brewer, and other villagers who liked to watch things rot. They would rather use the word ferment. And then sell it on as an ale with a made-up romantic name such as Badger's Bottom or Windy Dog. The door to the tavern creaked open, which made Gob jump. He quickly relaxed again when he saw the figure standing there. A sorry sight, with long unkempt hair, beard and ragged clothes. Gob could have sworn he saw a mouse poke its nose out of the hairy mess. "Oh, it's you," he said. "Bit early even by your standards, ain't it?" he added. The figure lowered his head slightly, seemingly embarrassed. "You serving, Gob?" it said, almost apologising. Gob sighed. "Of course, Seb, it'll take more than a few foul-horned riders for me to shut up shop." Seb looked around and found an unbroken stool, brushed it off and stood it upright on the floor. It amused Gob that he bothered brushing it off, considering what he was just about to put on it. "I'll have the usual then, please, Gob." "Hot as snot. I'm sure we still have some in the pump," Gob said, nodding, whilst making his way round the broken bar. Glass crunched underfoot. "Look, Gob," Seb said, pointing at a tankard hanging from the wall by itself. "My tankard is the only one not destroyed." "Lucky you," Gob said, sarcastically reaching for it. "Must be your lucky day." He then pulled the pump and a thick brown liquid oozed into the tankard. Once it was filled, he handed it over to Seb, who quickly gulped at it as if someone was about to steal it from him. The two men then sat in an awkward silence for a short while, which was violently interrupted by a table crashing to the floor. Neither of them moved or looked surprised. Eventually, Seb spoke. "Bit of a bugger all this." "Yep, you could say that," Gob replied. "Why exactly were they here this time?" Seb asked. "Looking for a symbol or summat. Check your place, did they?" "Yep, all night last night, just left them to it. What type of symbol was it?" "A symbol with a sword and an eye on it, so they say," Gob replied. "Got no idea why they think it's important enough to ruin a man's livelihood, though. I mean, it's bad enough they broke in like they did, but to—" Gob continued, only to be interrupted by the swinging tavern doors. Seb had gone, and wherever it was he went there quickly. Out in the realm, in a not very well hidden location, two men stood stroking their beards as men like this do. Wizards. Champion beard strokers and men of considerable theorisation is something they'd like to be known as. In this particular place, however, beards are normally stroked just after being put out with a bucket of water. Unfortunate dabblings with magic typically cause something to be alight at some point. However, on this occasion, everything was alright, everything was good. It had taken some time and effort for them to get to this point though, 5 years to be exact. 4 houses in FlowerDawn had been burnt down, along with 2 stables and a cow. The weather had been altered on 3 occasions, confusing the village folk and their crop hugely, and one man was accidentally teleported into the swamp. And if you asked them what exactly happened to Ethel's cat, they would say they would rather not answer. And if you add to that the considerable amount of man-hours they had put into this project, you would understand why just above those beards were smiling, almost grinning faces. "What's that one then?" one said, pointing. "Orkbuckle, 1st century," another replied. "And the gold item?" the first man said again. "We've been through this, Korak. It's an ancient musical device that you put in your mouth and twang a bit." Korak frowned. Oh, well, I disagree. It's quite obviously a thingy for getting bits of mud out of a horse's hoof, SilverWind. A horse's hoof? Why the blooming hell would you make it out of gold? SilverWind coughed. People were a lot more frivolous back then, Koraks started. Maybe it was a very important horse. Korak and SilverWind then stroked their beards at the same time before SilverWind said, As the coins? 2 from the Sublovian era and the gold ones from the Banter period, Korak answered. SilverWind looked impressed. Almost 10,000 years in the ground and now here on the table in front of us. Quite amazing, don't you think? The 2 men nodded and stroked their beards. Oi! An aggressive little voice said, I'm hungry! The 2 men sighed before SilverWind spoke. Your turn, I believe, Korak. Of course. And what do you think of a little celebration once I'm done? I think we've deserved it. Yes, a wonderful idea. I think we'll have a wee tipple at the tavern in the village, SilverWind answered. Meanwhile, 3 robed figures stood over a marbled altar which held a small pool of water. 2 black candles fizzed and popped in concert with the magic in the air. The man in the middle leant over the water and whispered an incantation. Flotoria, Aqua, Pastorius. The men either side of him waited and then edged back nervously. He stamped his foot and they shuffled back. This was dark magic, and dark magic by its own essence can lead to things generally not going as planned. Suddenly there was a huge flash. The man shot up, clenching his teeth and gripping the altar violently. Electric sparks cracked all over his body and a wind began spinning in the dark cave with a low, menacing roar behind it. He then screamed out another incarnation as the other 2 shrank behind the altar in fear. Decay! Aqua! Letoso! Slowly, the man then started to levitate, arms outstretched either side of him. His eyes turned white as gold electricity flashed over them. The 2 men held onto the altar for their lives as the wind and evil pulled at their bodies. Stop, boss! Make it stop! One of them shouted. And then, as quick as it had started, the storm inside the room stopped. There was a low, menacing hum as the man floated eerily, 2 white eyes leching from the darkness of his robe. The candles reignited themselves with a crackle as he floated over them. After a few moments, a ghostly circular blue shimmer began to appear in front of the man at the height of his head. A few moments after this, it became more pronounced and eventually a bright blue spinning void span in front of him. The other 2 men stared at the void, transfixed, terrified. Decay. Aqua. Letoso. Lestorius whispered with intent. Vague images began to appear within the blue spinning void, which then merged with others. Lestorius did his best to remember them as they came. A signpost, no, a church spiral, now a sword, important scriptures, witches, a war, death, a messenger, small creatures. And then rolling fields to the backdrop of a darkening grey sky. 2 men walking the fields, a scream, blurred images, blurred faces, gold, wizards. The floating man nodded and grinned. Immediately after this, the spell broke with a reversed scream. The void vanished and he dropped to the floor. His white eyes turned back to brown and the colour came back to his face as he sat with his back to the altar. The 2 men looked at him concerned. So? One asked. Tomorrow, we ride to our riches, Lestorius replied.